In the autumn of 1923, on the ragged edge of the Saskatchewan prairie, a small, grain town watched a local merchant destroy a young woman's name over a debt that was never hers to begin with. The merchant's name was Corbett Hale, and he was the kind of man who wore generosity like a coat, loudly, in public, and only when the weather suited him. The woman was Nettie Voss, a 32-year-old seamstress, who had spent the last 4 years raising her younger sister alone, after their parents died of the fever that swept through the valley in the winter of 1919, when Corbett declared publicly that Nettie had stolen fabric from his store. 6 yards of wool she said she had paid for, and he said she had not. The town believed him without asking why. Then a man named Aldous Price arrived. He was 44, a widower, a former land surveyor who had come north to disappear quietly into fieldwork and winter silences. He had not planned to stay in Millhaven. He had not planned to involve himself in anyone's trouble. But Aldous Price had a particular intolerance for men who used their position to grind down people who had no leverage to push back. And what he saw in Millhaven that autumn lodged itself under his skin like a splinter he could not leave alone. This is their story. The grain elevator cast its long shadow over the main street of Millhaven each morning, and by the time that shadow reached the door of Corbett's dry goods store, the town was already moving. Wagons came in from the outlying farms. Women gathered at the post office steps. Children ran errands with coins knotted in their pockets. It was an ordinary town in the way that ordinary towns often conceal their cruelties. Inside routine, behind familiar faces, beneath the polite noise of daily life. Nettie Voss had lived in Millhaven all her life and knew its rhythms the way you know a song you have sung. So many times you no longer hear the words. She ran her seamstress work from the back room of the small house she and her sister Bay shared on Larkin Street, 2 blocks from the water tower. The room smelled of cut cloth and beeswax and the cedar chips she tucked into the drawers to keep moths away. Her fingers were always slightly calloused at the tips. She slept lightly, woke early, and had learned not to expect much from the town that had watched her family diminish and offered mostly casseroles and commentary in return. She was not without warmth. The children in town adored her because she kept a tin of peppermint drops by the window and never refused a request to mend a favorite coat. The older women respected her work even when they did not quite know what to make of her composure. But Millhaven was a town where a woman's social standing was a delicate thing, easily tipped by association, by rumor, by the way the wrong man chose to tell a story. Corbett Hale told his story at the grain co-op meeting on a Thursday evening in October. He did not shout. That was the thing Nettie learned later, when the account reached her through a neighbor's careful retelling. He spoke calmly, almost with regret, and told the assembled men that he had noticed a discrepancy in his stock records and had come to understand, reluctantly, that Mrs. Nettie Voss had taken fabric without settling the full amount. He said he did not want to make it a matter of law. He said he hoped she would simply make it right. He said all of this in the tone of a man doing someone an undeserved kindness. By Friday morning, Nettie heard it on her front step. She stood in the doorway while her neighbor finished speaking and kept her expression, even though her hands had gone cold inside her apron pockets. She had paid for that wool. She had the receipt, or rather, she had had it. A paper she had tucked into the pocket of her work coat and not thought about since. The coat had gone to the church rummage sale 3 weeks ago, pocket contents and all. She went to Corbett's store that afternoon. She did not go in anger. She went because she believed that mistakes, even deliberate ones, could sometimes be corrected by a direct conversation. Corbett stood behind his counter with the satisfied stillness of a man who had already won. He listened to her with his hands clasped over his stomach and his eyes carrying just enough pity to be insulting. "I'm sorry, Nettie," he said, using her first name the way men used first names when they wanted to remind you of your place. "I can only go by my records. I have always paid," she said. "I know you mean to," he replied. She left, She did not slam the door. She walked home on the same street she had always walked, past the same storefronts, past the same faces that were now carrying the story of her in their eyes. She made supper. She helped Bea with her schoolwork. She sat at her sewing table long after the lamp should have been put out, and she did not sleep. Millhaven did not punish her dramatically. There was no single moment of cruelty she could point to. It was subtler than that, and therefore harder to answer. Women who had brought her mending stopped coming by. A family whose daughter's winter coat she had been altering sent word they would collect the unfinished garment. At the post office, conversation shortened when she arrived. She endured it the same way she endured Saskatchewan winters, by keeping her coat buttoned and her face forward and trusting that it could not last forever. She was not entirely sure she believed that, but she said it to herself anyway. Aldous Price had taken a room at the Millhaven boarding house on the 2nd of October, intending to stay 3 weeks while he completed a land assessment for a client north of town. He was a deliberate, quiet man. He was a deliberate who ate his meals at the end of the boarding house table and asked Nufford's fellow boarders, except that they leave him alone, which most of them were happy to do. He had a broad, weathered face and gray beginning at his temples, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who have been in the company of their own thoughts for a long time. His wife had died of a difficult childbirth 7 years ago. The child had not survived either. He had not spoken of this to anyone in Millhaven, or in the 2 towns before Millhaven, or in the years of fieldwork between them. He carried it the way you carry a stone in your boot, always aware of it, not always willing to stop and acknowledge it aloud. He heard about Nettie Voss the way everyone heard things in Millhaven, without asking for them. The boarding house table was a thorough news service. He listened without commenting, ate his soup, and went to bed thinking about survey lines. He thought about Nettie Voss again 2 days later, when he saw her at the General Post Office. She was collecting a small parcel, and the woman behind the counter, who had been laughing freely with the customer before her, became brisk and businesslike the moment Nettie stepped up. The shift was not dramatic. It was the kind of thing you would miss if you were not paying attention, or if you had decided not to. Aldous was paying attention. He had a surveyor's habit of noting boundaries, even the ones that were invisible. Nettie noticed nothing, or appeared to notice nothing. She accepted her parcel, thanked the woman behind the counter, and turned to leave. As she passed Aldous, he nodded. She nodded back, briefly, the way strangers do. He walked back to his boarding house and thought about what he had seen. He had no reason to get involved. He knew no one in this town. He had no stake in its social arrangements and no desire to acquire one. But he had spent years measuring land, and he understood something about disputed claims. That the longer an unjust boundary went unchallenged, the more permanent it became. And something, in the clear, unhurried way Nettie had thanked the woman who had just been cold to her, made him feel the particular discomfort of a man watching an injustice settle in. He went to Corbett's store on a Wednesday, not to intervene, he told himself, but to buy lamp oil and form his own impression. Corbett was a florid, broad-shouldered man who smiled at customers the way a bank smiles at deposits. He chatted easily with Aldous, complimented his line of work, suggested a good boarding rate for winter. He was the sort of man who made a room feel warmer and smaller at the same time. Aldous asked, in the way of a man making idle conversation, whether Corbett kept careful records. "Every merchant worth his salt," Corbett said cheerfully. "Every transaction logged. That must keep disputes clean," Aldous said. Corbett's smile did not change. "It does," he said. "Clear records make for clear accounts." Aldous paid for his lamp oil and left. He stood in the October wind outside the store for a moment. He had not learned anything definite, but a man who trumpeted the honesty of his record-keeping with that kind of readiness usually had a particular reason for wanting those records to be believed. He had 1 more week of survey work north of town. He did not go looking for more information about Nettie Voss, But it came to him anyway, as things do in small towns, tucked inside other conversations. He learned from his client's wife that Nettie's father had owed Corbett a modest sum at the time of his death, a debt that Corbett had publicly forgiven with much visible generosity, and that had earned him considerable goodwill. He learned from the hardware store owner, over a discussion of survey stakes, that Corbett had made a similar quiet accusation against a farmhand 2 seasons ago, and that the farmhand had left town before anything was resolved. He learned from the boarding house owner's daughter, who was 16 and had excellent ears, that Corbett's store accounts had been audited once and had come out clean, which was the fact Corbett had made sure everyone remembered, and the only fact he had made sure everyone remembered. None of it was proof. All of it mattered. On a cold Thursday afternoon, Aldous finished his last survey line and walked back into Millhaven. He stopped at the church office. He asked to speak with the minister about the autumn rummage sale, and after a 15-minute conversation that touched briefly on the general satisfaction of charitable works, he learned that the coats and jackets from the rummage sale had gone to 3 families and 1 traveler, and that 1 wool coat, gray, woman's cut, had gone to a family in the Dewhurst settlement 8 miles north. Aldous borrowed a horse from his boarding house client the next morning. The Dewhurst settlement was a small cluster of homesteads occupied by a Ukrainian family who had farmed the land since 1905 and kept everything in careful order. The mother of the family met him at the door with the wariness of a woman who had learned to be cautious of unknown men arriving with questions. He explained himself plainly. He said he was looking for a receipt that had been left in the pocket of a donated coat, that it was a matter of some importance to the woman who had donated it, and that he had no interest in troubling anyone. The mother brought out the coat. It was hanging on a hook inside the door. Worn twice, she said, because 1 sleeve had already been neatly repaired by whoever owned it before. She checked the pockets. The left one was empty. The right one held a folded paper, slightly creased, with the moisture of weeks on it. Aldous opened it carefully. It was a receipt from Corbett Hale's dry goods store, dated the 14th of September, 6 yards of gray wool, paid in full, signed by Corbett himself. He rode back to Millhaven with the paper in his breast pocket. He did not go to Corbett. He did not go to the town council. He went to Nettie Voss's house on Larkin Street and knocked at the door. She answered with the alert, reserved expression of a woman who had learned not to assume that a knock meant good news. When she saw a stranger, tall, gray-templed, holding his hat in both hands, she waited. "My name is Aldous Price," he said. "I've been doing survey work north of town. I believe I have something that belongs to you." He held out the receipt. Nettie looked at it. Her hand came up slowly and took it. She read it once. She read it a second time. Her face did not collapse. She did not cry. What happened was quieter than that. A kind of stillness crossed her, the way stillness crosses water after you've thrown in a stone and the surface finally settles. "How?" she said. He told her, plainly, without embellishment, the way you explain a survey result. "Here is what I found. Here is where I found it. Here is what it means." Nettie stood with the receipt in her hands and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "You didn't have to do this." "No," Aldous agreed. "Why did you?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't like watching people absorb damage they don't owe," he said finally. She looked at him then, the way she had looked at very few people in Millhaven, directly, without the social performance of polite gratitude. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." He sat at her kitchen table while she made the tea, and they talked for a while about the receipt and what to do with it. She was steady and precise in her thinking. She wanted to go to the town council, not to shout, but to correct the record quietly, and let the truth carry its own weight. He agreed that was the right approach. He said he would come with her if she wanted a witness. She said she would think about it. He left before supper. He came back the next morning. He came back the next morning because it seemed like the thing to do. and because the boarding house breakfast had been meager, and because he had found himself thinking about the kettle and the kitchen table and the particular quality of a conversation with someone who thought before they spoke. Nettie let him in without ceremony and poured coffee and told him she had decided to go to the council on Monday and would be glad of a witness. "All right," he said. They went on Monday. The council meeting was held in the back room of the town hall, a low-ceiling space that smelled of old paper and wood smoke. 4 men sat at the long table. Corbett Hale was not on the council but was present as a town businessman, which amounted to the same thing in Millhaven. He sat with his arms crossed, and his expression carrying that same careful, patient pity he had worn at the store counter. Aldous had asked Nettie, before they went in, how she wanted to handle it. She said she wanted to speak for herself, and he said that was exactly right. She presented the receipt. She explained where it had been found. She explained what it documented. She did not accuse Corbett of anything specific. She said only that her records had been correct, and that she would appreciate the public acknowledgement of that fact. The council members looked at the receipt. They looked at Corbett. Corbett's pity recalibrated into something more careful. He said he must have made a clerical error. He said he was glad it had been resolved. He said he hoped Nettie understood it had been an honest mistake. The oldest council member, a dry-voiced farmer named Ira Stellan, who had been on the council for 22 years and had the patience of a man who had seen every kind of misdirection, looked at Corbett over his reading glasses and said, "This receipt is in your own hand, Corbett." Corbett said nothing. Ira looked at Nettie. "The record is corrected," he said. "We'll see that it's known." Corbett stood up and left before the meeting formally closed. His footsteps on the wood floor were the only sound for a moment. Then Ira said mildly, to no one in particular, "I will be reviewing the accounts of that farmhand who left 2 seasons ago." Outside on the town hall steps, the October air was cold and clean and smelled of turned earth from the farms on the edge of town. Nettie stood with her receipt folded in her coat pocket, and her face turned slightly into the wind. She did not look like a woman who had won something. She looked like a woman who had been returned something that should never have been taken. "Thank you," she said to Aldous without looking at him. "You did that," he said. "I would have had nothing to show without you." "You would have kept standing," he said. "That was always yours." She turned and looked at him then. He had a plain, honest face, not especially handsome, marked by years of outdoor work, and probably by things he did not discuss. His eyes were the gray-green of lake water, and held the steadiness of someone who had been in difficult places and not broken. "What happens now for you?" she asked. "Your survey work is finished." "It is," he said. "Where do you go?" He looked down the main street of Millhaven, at the grain elevator and the bare October trees, and the small, orderly storefronts that contained, like all small towns, both more kindness and more cruelty than any stranger expected to find. "I haven't decided," he said. Nettie nodded slowly, as if this were a reasonable and not particularly surprising answer. The following week, Aldous found that he had not yet made arrangements to leave. He told himself he was reviewing his survey notes and writing up his final report for his client, both of which were true. He also found himself on Larkin Street more mornings than could be fully explained by survey notes. Nettie accepted his company with the same composure she applied to most things, not effusively, not cautiously, but naturally, as if it were a reasonable development that 2 sensible people had arrived at without much ceremony. He fixed a loose step on her front porch one morning, because he had noticed it and had a hammer. She made him lunch and did not make a fuss about it. Her sister Bea was 14 and watchful and asked him direct questions at the table that he answered without evasion, which seemed to satisfy her. The town noticed, as towns do. Some of it was warm. Older women who had quietly never been comfortable with the business of Nettie's reputation found that the correction had given them permission to correct themselves as well. The woman at the post office was brisk with everyone again, which was at least consistent. The family who had sent for their unfinished coat had not sent an apology, but they had sent Bea a bag of apples from their orchard, which was the nearest they were prepared to come to one. Some of it was not warm. Corbett Hale did not acknowledge Nettie or Aldous on the street. His wife did, once, briefly, with the uncertain look of a woman navigating territory her husband had mined carelessly, but doing it honestly anyway. Ira Stellan stopped Aldous outside the hardware store one afternoon and told him, in his dry way, that the accounts of the farmhand had indeed revealed an irregularity, and that Corbett had agreed to correct a number of outstanding matters without further need for council involvement, which was how Ira chose to describe it. Aldous thanked him. Ira said it was not his thanks that were required, looked pointedly in the direction of Larkin Street, and walked on. On a November evening, when the first real snow had come and settled, Aldous sat at Nettie's kitchen table, while Bea did her schoolwork at the other end, and the lamp cast its warm circle over all of it. Nettie was mending a winter coat, the needle moving with the unhurried rhythm of someone who has done a thing so many times it has become a form of thinking. He was reading an old copy of a survey journal, and not reading it. He set it down. "I want to stay through winter," he said. Nettie did not look up from her mending. "The boarding house runs through March," she said. "I meant in Millhaven," he said, "not specifically the boarding house." She looked up then. Her needle paused. He had thought about how to say the next part, and had decided that a man who had spent 7 years being careful with himself did not need to be additionally careful with words that were straightforwardly true. "I am not asking for anything," he said, "except the chance to see whether what I think is happening is actually happening." Nettie held his gaze for a moment. Her expression was not coy, and it was not guarded. It was the same clear, assessing look she had given him on her doorstep the day he brought the receipt, the look of someone deciding whether a thing was what it appeared to be. "That seems fair," she said. "I'm not a straightforward man to know," he added, in the spirit of honesty. "I carry a fair amount that I don't put into words easily." "I'm not looking for easy," Nettie said. "I've never had much use for easy." Bea did not look up from her schoolwork, but she was smiling, which she thought no one could see because she had her hair tucked down. Nettie could see it. She chose not to comment. He stayed through winter. By December, he had taken a room not at the boarding house but above the hardware store, which suited him better and was closer to Larkin Street, which he did not point out. He had found work consulting on a drainage project west of town, which would carry him through to spring. He chopped Nettie's wood without making a production of it. He attended church with her twice, which was 2 more times than he had attended church in the previous 3 years. But it was a sensible thing to do, and the minister gave short sermons. He met her friends, the ones who had returned after the council meeting. A small, loyal circle of women who looked him over with the frank appraisal of people who had watched their friend carry more than her share for a long time, and wanted to be sure she was not exchanging one difficult for another. He passed whatever inspection they were conducting. He didn't know exactly what he had done to pass it and did not ask. He told her about his wife one evening in January, on the walk back from the church social, while the snow was steady and the street lamps were making gold circles on the white ground. He said it plainly, the same way he said most things. The year, the name Eleanor, the nature of the loss. He did not make it into a dramatic accounting. He said it was a thing that had happened, and that it had changed the shape of his life, and that he had sometimes wondered if he had let it close him off in ways he had not fully examined. Nettie listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago," he said. "Grief doesn't have a schedule," she said. He looked at her sideways in the lamplight. She was looking ahead, her breath steady in the cold air, her profile calm and unperforming. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They walked the rest of the way in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of people who have said enough for one night and know it. In March, the drainage project completed its first phase. and Aldous rode out to the site to verify the final measurements. He spent 2 days in the field and came back to find a covered plate on the step outside his room, above the hardware store, which was Nettie's way of doing a thing without requiring acknowledgement, which was, he had come to understand very much how she operated. He brought the plate back to Larkin Street on a Saturday and knocked. Bea let him in, with the breezy authority of a 15-year-old who has decided she approves of a situation and sees no reason to be subtle about it. Nettie was at her sewing table. She looked up when he came in, and the look was easy and warm in the way looks become when two people have spent a winter learning each other and have found the process worthwhile. He set the plate on the counter. "I want to ask you something," he said. Bea immediately became very interested in her book. Nettie set her needle down and turned in her chair. "All right," she said. He had thought about this considerably less than you might expect, because he had found that overthinking was a habit that did not serve him, and that some things were clear enough on their own. He said what he meant, without prologue. She listened. She did not answer immediately, which he had come to appreciate about her. She treated questions with the weight they deserved. "Yes," she said, "on the condition that we're partners in what we build, not landlord and tenant, partners." He said that's the only kind I was offering. And she believed him, because in 7 months she had never seen him be anything other than exactly what he said he was. They were married in April, in the same church where he had attended services twice, in a ceremony that was modest and precise and exactly suited to them both. Bea stood beside Nettie, in a new dress Nettie had made from blue wool she had purchased, receipt in hand, from a dry goods store 2 towns over. Corbett Hale was not there, which was the correct arrangement. Ira Stellan was, which was also correct. The minister, to his credit, gave a short sermon. Afterward, in the pale spring light outside the church, the small gathering of people who had come. Friends, neighbors, Aldis's survey client and his family, the woman from the post office who had brought a cake by way of amends, made the ordinary warm noise of people who are glad to be in one place at one time. Nettie stood with her hand light on Aldis's arm and received the well wishes with the composure she brought to most things, and something else now, something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. She had not spent 4 hard years keeping herself intact so that she could dissolve gratefully at the first sign of kindness. She had done it so that when something real came, she would know the difference. She knew the difference. Bea, who was 16 by then, and had the opinion of someone twice her age, said on the walk home that it had been a very good wedding for a short one. Aldous said he agreed. Nettie said she had always found that the things that lasted were rarely the ones that made the most noise. Bea said she was going to put that on a sampler. Nettie laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came without planning. The sound carried down the April Street, and Aldous heard it and kept walking beside her and did not remark on it, because it did not need remarking on. It was simply the sound of a woman who had held on long enough for things to become what they ought to have been all along. And in Millhaven, on that particular Saturday in spring, with the snow finally gone, and the fields beginning to show their first faint green, that sound felt like exactly the right note on which to end a long, undeserved silence.